Thank you for joining. It looks like we have about 53 people on the line so far. So we'll give a brief introduction to the network anyways, just since you might not have been able to hear during the video. And then the topic of today's webinar will be on vertical integration in the NAP process, linking national and subnational adaptation planning. So we have Angie Dazé, who works with us here at the Network Secretariat at IISD, Aditya Bahadur, from Action on Climate Today, and then an interview about Nepal's experience with Batu Krishna Upreti, the team leader for the NAP formulation process in Nepal. There will be time for questions at the end as well. So you should be able to just type those into the chat box. We'll read them out and direct them to the panelists at the end of the webinar. So just briefly on the network for those who maybe aren't familiar with it. The network was established at the end of 2014 at COP20 in Lima by developing countries and bilateral donors who recognize the growing importance of the NAP process and the need for enhanced support and coordination around it. We have initial financial support from Germany and the United States, and a number of new bilateral donors have joined the network recently as well. So our niche, we consider that to be based on coordination of the efforts of many actors who need to be involved in the NAP process. So domestic actors, but also development partners supporting them. Learning about approaches and best practices for successful national adaptation planning and action based on the experiences countries are gaining as they engage in the process. And the importance of bilateral support for the NAP process, particularly given the high proportion of bilateral support for adaptation in climate-sensitive sectors. So we see all of these as key to our goal of enhancing national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. We currently have participants in about 85 countries around the world participating in the network through the following activity areas. So just briefly, we focus on sustained peer learning and exchange, supporting national level action, and enhancing bilateral support for the NAP process. So there's some of the key activities listed here, and if you're interested in how you can get involved with some of those, you can also check that out on our website. So to inform all these activities, we also conduct analysis and develop communications and knowledge products on specific topics related to the NAP process. And that's where the webinar series fits in. Vertical integration is one of the themes that we've worked on quite a bit so far. But generally, the webinar series will feature country case studies and comparative frameworks, expert interventions and guidance on key topics, and lessons emerging from peer learning and exchange activities. So, for example, cases that might result from our targeted topics forums. So before we close at the end, we'll give a bit more information on next steps, how you can get involved in the network, and what's coming up in our webinar series. But before we do that, I think we'll just get right into some of the content. So we'll be starting with Angie Dazé. She'll be giving an introduction to the topic of vertical integration in the NAP process based on some work she's been leading with our team. So with that, I think I'll just pass to Angie.
Thank you, Hayley. So I'm just going to provide a very brief introduction to the concept of vertical integration and what's needed to enable it in that process. So what do we mean when we talk about vertical integration in the NAP process? Basically, we're talking about linking national and subnational adaptation efforts throughout planning, implementation, and M&E. Our definition emphasizes the need for these linkages to be intentional, so we want to see them arising from a mandate to engage subnational stakeholders, and we want them to be built into the NAP process from the beginning. We don't want to see vertical integration as an afterthought. We also highlight the need for a strategic approach to vertical integration in terms of building on existing systems and structures, identifying the best entry points, and making efficient use of capacity and resources. And I just want to mention right up front that when I refer to subnational levels throughout this presentation, we're talking about all of the levels that exist below the national level, including subnational government structures, but also the community level. Why do we think the vertical integration in NAP processes is so important? Well, we have a few reasons. For starters, relevant decisions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change provide a strong imperative for engaging subnational actors. For example, the Paris Agreement calls for stronger, more ambitious climate action by cities and other subnational authorities, local communities, and Indigenous peoples. And it also highlights the need to enhance capacities at subnational levels and support local communities and Indigenous peoples in responding to climate change. On a similar line, the NAP decision from COP17 emphasizes the need for adaptation action to be participatory, transparent, and gender sensitive, taking vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems into consideration. And we believe that vertical integration is fundamental to putting these principles into practice. At a more practical level, it's just recognized that much of the implementation of adaptation actions will occur at subnational levels, even if they're guided by the national framework of a NAP process. And finally, we have quite a few years of experience with locally driven approaches to adaptation, such as community-based adaptation, and these have generated good results in building individual and community adaptive capacity. So what all of this means is that vertical integration in the NAP process is critical, both to align with the principles and objectives of the convention and to ensure that our adaptation efforts are effective, particularly when we are concerned with reaching the most vulnerable people and communities and enhancing ecosystem resilience. When looking at how vertical integration occurs, we need to keep in mind that, like the NAP process itself, it has to be an iterative process and it will be unique to the country context. So it's most likely that you'll have concurrent things happening on adaptation at the national level and at subnational levels. The key is to ensure that these processes are joined up and that they're informing each other over time. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that how vertical integration occurs in a particular country will really depend on a number of different factors. One is the institutional structures that already exist or will be established for adaptation, and how these can be organized in a way that they facilitate the national-subnational linkages. The next very important factor is the degree of progress on decentralization and how and the extent to which responsibilities for planning, budgeting, implementation, and so on have been devolved to subnational authorities. And finally, the existing capacity of different actors at both national and subnational levels to work on adaptation, to engage different stakeholders in the process, and to collaborate with each other. So all of these are factors that will determine the best way forward on vertical integration for a particular country. What I'm going to present in the following slides is based on our guidance note on vertical integration in national adaptation plan processes, which we launched at COP22 in Marrakesh. We designed this guidance note to provide NAP country teams and other stakeholders with flexible but targeted guidance for strengthening vertical integration in NAP processes. It's designed to be complementary to other guidelines developed for NAPs, notably the technical guidelines developed by the Least Developed Countries Expert Group. And you'll find this vertical integration guidance note on the list of supplementary materials to the LEG guidelines. The note presents key issues for vertical integration throughout planning, implementation, and M&E, as well as the enabling factors for this to occur. And I'm going to talk more particularly about these enabling factors. This graphic provides an overview of what we're aiming for with vertical integration. So in the outer circle, we have the NAP process, which we've organized into 3 key dimensions: planning, implementation, and M&E. And the fact that this is a circle highlights that this is an iterative process over time. So during planning, vertical integration yields mutually supportive adaptation planning processes at national and subnational levels. When we get into implementation, we want vertical integration to lead to coordinated implementation by national and subnational actors. And for monitoring and evaluation, it's really about ensuring that results and lessons from subnational levels are captured in M&E systems and that they're used in ongoing decision-making and future planning for adaptation. In the center of the circle, we have the enabling factors, which we feel must be in place for everything else to happen. So the institutional arrangements are critical to facilitate ongoing dialogue between actors at different levels. Information sharing, both climate information and information on the NAP process itself and how it is evolving, enables coordination and informed decision-making at all levels. And finally, capacity development ensures that the different actors at the different levels have capacity that they need for vertical integration to occur. And when we're looking at national stakeholders, this also includes the capacity to engage the subnational stakeholders in inclusive participatory processes, in addition to technical capacities related to adaptation that are needed at all levels. In order for vertical integration to happen, the three enabling factors are key. This graphic demonstrates the relevance of the enabling factors throughout the entire process. What's important to keep in mind is that the purpose and the focus of these factors will change depending on the dimension. So for example, during planning, the institutional arrangements focus on linking up the planning process at the different levels, while in implementation, it's more about coordination and channeling resources. The thing to keep in mind is that ideally the strategy for the enabling factors will be established at the outset of the NAP process during the roadmap phase, with a view to how they'll evolve over the course of this iterative process. This is just one example to give you a general sense of what vertical integration may look like in practice. So here we're looking at the planning dimension, where plans are developed at national and subnational levels, including the community level, and these are represented by the blue boxes. The blue arrows represent the connections between these plans, with plans at higher levels providing a framework and direction for adaptation planning at the lower levels, and lower level plans feeding up to inform planning at higher levels, for example, by identifying particularly vulnerable groups or ecosystems and priority adaptation options in a particular part of the country. If we zoom in on the enabling factors here, we see that each has a critical role to play in ensuring joint planning at national and subnational levels. The institutional arrangements put in place for the NAP process must foster collaboration, allowing coordination, capacity development, and information sharing to occur throughout the iterative planning process. During the planning stage, information sharing is focused on the issues that inform planning, including development needs, climate vulnerabilities, and adaptation options identified at different levels. Capacity development has to occur both at the national level to develop skills to engage the subnational actors in the process, and at subnational levels to ensure that governmental and non-governmental actors, as well as stakeholders, are able to effectively participate in adaptation planning processes. And similar processes occur during implementation in M&E. As I mentioned previously, the details of how this all happens will differ from country to country, but the critical issue is ensuring that there's ongoing dialogue and coordination among the actors at different levels, and a commitment by the NAP team, the coordination mechanism to vertical integration throughout the process is really key to facilitating this. I'll stop there so we can hear about some practical examples. Just to flag that the guidance note that I mentioned is available for download at the NAP Global Network website, along with a number of other resources on vertical integration. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Angie. So we do have Aditya's presentation coming up next, sharing some experiences from South Asia. Before we get into that, I'll just mention there is a handout that you should see in the webinar that you can download with links to all the resources Angie's referred to, and we'll send that to you in your follow-up emails as well. And before we go into Aditya's presentation, we actually just have a quick interactive poll that you can participate in. So I think we'll just get that started up. So the question is, which is the biggest challenge in enabling vertical integration in your country? So you have the choice to look at institutional arrangements to link national and subnational levels, sharing information between national and subnational levels, and developing capacity at subnational levels. So we'll just give you a minute or two to respond, and then we'll move on. Okay, so we'll have the results of that and we'll let you know how that went, but maybe for now I'll just pass it to Aditya. He works as the Regional Program Development Manager at Action on Climate Today, and he's going to be speaking to some experiences from South Asia. So Aditya?
Thank you, Hayley. A very good evening to everyone, and a big thank you to the NAP Global Network for inviting the Action on Climate Today program to share our insights on vertical integration in the NAP. I'm going to speak for just over 10 minutes today, and I'm going to start off by giving you a quick, very short overview of our program, and then to talk about some imperatives for vertical integration before talking about some of the forms that vertical integration has taken in India and Nepal, and then focus on the NAP development process and vertical integration across it more specifically. I'd also like to mention that I'm very much the opening act for the main act, which is the conversation with Mr. Battu Opreti, who will join us after my presentation. He's the team leader of Nepal's NAP development process, a very senior bureaucrat, and was the LDC chair. So he'll be able to answer all the tough questions. I'll take all the low balls from all of you. Pleasure to be here. Just to kick things off very quickly, I work for the Action on Climate Today program, which is a 5-year initiative funded by DFID and provides direct technical assistance to the governments of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Nepal on climate policy issues. We work in 4 sectoral domains that includes agriculture, water, governance, and finance. And as part of our portfolio on governance, we're working with the governments of Nepal and India to support them in developing their national adaptation plans, and that's why I'm here. A quick overview of some key outcomes. We've helped countries in South Asia garner 111 million pounds in fresh climate finance from international and national funds. We've developed new policies that enable governments to mainstream climate change. We've developed new decision support systems that help them take key decisions around climate-informed, climate-compatible development. We shaped investments of multilateral and bilateral banks in order to make them more to invest better in adaptation. And we've done some preliminary calculations and find that over a 10-year period, these activities will help ameliorate close to $7 billion worth of damage from climate change. So now that I've patted myself on the back, I'll get to the heart of the issue here, which is vertical integration. I think Angie's already spoken about the imperative and the reasons for why vertical integration is important. I have a few additional reasons that I'll go over very quickly. One is there's quite a strong general imperative. The impacts of climate change are realized at a local level, and therefore it's vital that people who are at the forefront of the battle against climate change, who are experiencing the impacts, really have a say in what's happening in national level adaptation policy architecture. Also, in countries like India that have a fairly sophisticated sort of decentralization process, subnational governments have quite a lot of autonomy to make plans and policies that have a direct impact on adaptive capacity. As an example, in India, the states or provinces have the mandate to make plans and policies around agriculture, water, forests, and a number of other climate sensitive sectors, and therefore they are vital in any discussion on adaptation planning and policy. Also, many subnational entities govern massive areas. Uttar Pradesh, which is India's most populous province, has a population that's close to that of Brazil's. So yes, it's we need to take them seriously. We need to include them in any discussion on adaptation. There are a bunch of specific imperatives that Angie's covered that I'm not going to go over. Essentially, the NAP technical guidelines have vertical integration written across them in a large number of instances, and there is a very strong specific imperative for this. Integrating vertically across scales can help overcome a number of barriers. Many times subnational entities, subnational governments may find it difficult to generate resources and financing for adaptation activities, and closer links with national level frameworks and a closer link with national governments can help facilitate flows of finance either from national funds like India's National Adaptation Fund or through international funds like the Green Climate Fund. There are also political institutional barriers that vertical integration can help overcome. In some circumstances, subnational governments may not feel like they have the mandate to make policy changes or changes in protocol and processes that help develop adaptive capacity. A stronger link across scales of government can help develop and deliver this mandate to subnational governments. Also, many times, institutions producing the latest cutting-edge information on climate change or weather data are national level institutions, and subnational entities may have difficulty in accessing these, but a tighter coupling between national and subnational entities will help make this flow of information much smoother. Similarly, national governments can play a key role in setting the policy environment that makes it possible to incubate and deploy new technologies for adaptation, and therefore this tighter coupling across scales is vitally important. So that's a very quick overview of why we feel that vertical integration in the NAP process is really important. Here are some ways in which it can come to life and what vertical integration actually looks like. Here are a couple of examples. So one of the forms of vertical integration is integration across plans and policies. For example, India has a National Disaster Management Plan and a National Disaster Management Act. We also have state disaster management plans that help bring this national vision enshrined in the national documents to life at the state level. And then 80% of India's districts have district disaster management plans that really provides the nuts and bolts of operationalizing the vision enshrined in the state level plans. Similarly, we have a national action plan on climate change at the national level, and then we have state action plans on climate change, which play roughly the same function as what I just spoke about. And in Nepal, we have the National Adaptation Program of Action, the NAPA, and we have the local adaptation plans for action, which are the LAPAs. So one vision of vertical integration is integration across plans and policy processes. Another is integration across institutions. Again, in India, we have the National Disaster Management Authority, we have state disaster management authorities, and then we have district disaster management authorities. Again, in India, at the national level, we have the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, we have the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, and then we have state climate change cells in each state. In Nepal, there are national ministries that are part of dialogue on national adaptation planning. Each of these national ministries, for example, the Ministry of Health, has subsidiary institutions at the subnational level, at the district and local level. And then there are village development committees at the village level that are empowered to deploy development plans. There are also in Nepal district development committees, which are an intermediary governance institution that has quite a powerful mandate of designing and deploying a variety of development plans. And the National Adaptation Plan process that I'll talk about in a minute and that Batuji will explore to a greater extent immediately after this is linking in with all these institutions that already exist at different levels of governance in Nepal. Coming specifically to the NAP development process in Nepal, according to me, it's one of the most consultative processes that's unfolding anywhere. At the heart of the process are 7 thematic working groups that are working at the national level. Each of these is led by sectoral national line ministries such as water, agriculture, health, urban development, tourism. Each of these is leading one of these thematic groups for NAP formulation. There are also 2 cross-cutting working groups, one on gender and one on governance. And at the national level, it is these group of empowered actors that are coming together in this cross-sectoral manner to help take adaptation planning forward. Now, each of these national level institutions has subsidiary institutions at the district and local level, like I mentioned on the previous slide. And these institutions are also part of the consultation process of the NAP. So the National Ministry of Health is speaking to district level health institutions and local level health institutions in order to understand the vulnerabilities of the health sector to climate change, and then they will be involved in determining adaptation priorities across scales. Another way in which vertical integration is taking place in the NAP development process in Nepal is through multi-level governance institutions. At the national level, we have these ministries. At the district level, we have these district development committees. And at the local level, we have these village development committees. And again, these multi-level governance institutions are part of this big dialogue to consolidate the national adaptation plan. There's a third and quite interesting route through which vertical integration in the NAP is manifesting itself. Nepal, as many of you would be aware, has a very rich constellation of actors which are working on different kinds of adaptation programs funded by donors and other entities across scales. And the NAP process is linking in with all of these to make sure that they're drawing on the right insights. For example, there's the Nepal Climate Change Support Program, which is a donor-driven adaptation program that has helped develop the local adaptation plans of action. And the NAP process is drawing on M&E data from the NCCSP to make sure that the national adaptation plan that they're consolidating is informed by the insights of this donor-driven program that's working at the local level. Similarly, our program, which is funded by the UK Department for International Development, has worked with the Nepal Central Bureau of Statistics to undertake a survey with 5,000 households to understand climate impacts, including perception-based and subjective data. And now we're working with the National Adaptation Plan process to make sure that this survey data informs NAP development. So this is another example of how local levels are being connected with the NAP development process at a national level. So that's Nepal, three key routes through which vertical integration is taking place. I'd be interested to see if Bahadur has other visions of vertical integration that I'm missing. In India, to be honest, the NAP development process is at a very formative stage. So it's very difficult to make any strong assertions of what this will look like, but it's assumed that it will be fairly similar to what we've just discussed in the case of Nepal. This table essentially looks at the agriculture sector and their involvement in the NAP design process. And again, as you will see, at the federal level, at the national level, we have the Ministry of Agriculture, and at the state level, we have the state departments for agriculture, and then we have at the district level, the district magistrate's office, which is the nodal district level governance institution, and then Panchayati Raj institutions in rural areas and urban local bodies in urban areas. So again, sectoral and non-sectoral governance institutions are being are part of the vision of NAP development to bring this whole idea of vertical integration to life. Crucially, in India, there's a lot of technical capacity through national level institutions such as the Indian Institutes of Technology, and they're a key part of the vision for vertical integration as well, where these national level institutions will help develop data that will be then transmitted across scales of government for reality checks and for adding more sort of bottom-up insights to this top-down information. So again, vertical integration firmly in the sights of the NAP development process, but at the moment some lack of clarity on how exactly it will happen. But I think over the next few months we'll have much more clarity. I'm going to, before I start my interview with Bahadur, I just thought I'll have this one slide up. You would have seen this in the previous presentation that Angie gave. What I've done is overlaid it with what I feel is happening in Nepal and India, and I won't go through through all the 9 boxes because we'll be here till tomorrow, but I'll give a couple of quick examples. When it comes to institutional arrangements for vertical integration and planning, in Nepal, there's already an in-principle link because they have local adaptation plans of action, and they have a national adaptation program of action, and now they have the national adaptation plan. And they're already starting to link these processes by drawing on M&E data from the LAPAs that is being generated by donor-driven programs. In India, again, we have the National Action Plan on Climate Change and we have the State Action Plan on Climate Change. So there is an existing institutional precedent for linking national and subnational adaptation plans, and we feel that these are the structures that will be drawn upon when the vertical integration when starts for the NAP development process. Similarly, when we look at implementation and information sharing in Nepal, there's a mix of bottom-up and top-down vulnerability assessments that's taking place. Bottom-up through understanding the climate impacts on the ground, and top-down through using technology and science-based understandings of vulnerability to do a fairly comprehensive understanding of vulnerability. And this is the way in which information is flowing up and down across scales of government in Nepal in the NAP development process. In India, there's a clear statement of the need for national level institutions to share information with subnational level institutions, and we hope that that will pan out as planned. When it comes to M&E, there's some capacity in Nepal to do M&E across scale, especially because they have this M&E capacity for local adaptation plans, local adaptation plans for actions, the LAPAs. In India, M&E capacity for adaptation is fairly low. There's quite a robust subnational governance capacity. So the feeling is that that will be drawn upon, and capacity building needs to take place to convert some of that governance capacity and dedicate it for M&E for adaptation. I realize I've raced through that presentation, but I'm going to, of course, this will be on the website, and I'm here for any questions. And of course, please feel free to follow up with me if there's anything that I haven't been clear about. With Hayley's permission, I'm going to transition very quickly into the next and more exciting part of the discussion, which is with Batuji, who's very kindly joined us from Nepal. He's busy leading a team of consultants working very closely with government developing the NAP. So we're very grateful for his time. As I said, he's been a senior bureaucrat in the country and also an experienced negotiator in the past. So he has a lot of good experience. Batuji, a very warm welcome to you on this webinar. Just to kick things off, I wanted to ask you that currently the policy environment in Nepal is in flux, especially because you have an ongoing process of decentralization and constitutional change. Tell us a little bit about how the formation of new provinces and states is influencing your plans for vertical integration in Nepal's NAP process.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you very much for elaborating the vertical integration, including from Nepal. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
First of all, let me share how Nepal is engaged in climate change adaptation. As you know, as a LDC, Nepal prepared NAPA in 2010 to address most urgent and immediate adaptation options. As you clearly indicated, we prepared local national framework for local plans for action, popularly known as LAPAs, to local adaptation actions as prioritized in the NAPA. The LAPA framework is still appropriate for sensitization, assessment, identification, and selection of adaptation actions and implement them, because it is already adapted and it is people-centric in nature as it engage local peoples. It provides opportunities to implement standalone LAPA and get adaptation into local to national processes. The another important element is Nepal's climate change policy 2011 as a provision to channel more than 80% of the climate change fund to activities. That is well practiced in the LAPAs. That is, we have a lot of experience on how we can localize climate change adaptation. Now you have rightly indicated that we are really in the transitional stage. Nepal has a federal system of governance. The Constitution of Nepal 2015 provides provisions on climate change. That's one very important element to move ahead. The NAP will provide broad-based adaptation options to address medium and long adaptation needs. And this could be done at the federal level, state level, and the local level. Our understanding is that these adaptation options will be first identified and prioritized on vulnerability and risk assessment at the federal level, and states will integrate climate change adaptation into their planning process. And because our unit of analysis for vulnerability and the risk assessment will be district, and the districts are well maintained in the new constitutional provision. Once these adaptation options in the state plan will provide guidance to the village assembly and municipality plans and programs. In the text, NAP objective of integrating adaptation into local level will be in such plan is prepared for addressing local level climate change impacts, and during the NAP process itself will ensure the participation of local level institutions right from vulnerability and risk assessment, because the NAP approach is leave no one behind in the NAP process. will also ensure climate change adaptation through planning process in line with the drafted local governance. It means there is no problem for vertical integration. This is the objective of the NAP to help people to address site-specific climate change impacts. In fact, we are now working on how adaptation options could be integrated into the local planning process through the legal system as well.
Wow,
Thank you.
great. Bhattaji, I think that's a very interesting point that you raised. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, at the subnational level and at the local level, there are a vast number of competing priorities. And you worked many years in government, so you know this better than anyone else does. How do you really incentivize subnational governance entities, be it state governments, district development committees, village development committees, to take adaptation seriously and to actually follow through on the vision of integrating across scales to deliver the national adaptation plan? Why should they prioritize this over other activities that they're probably busy with? What are the kind of arguments that you've used or incentives that you've deployed?
Our experience from the last in the last decade, while we started working on climate change, is that it's a people demand initiatives. Not in fact, we have not injected from the center. The people are facing more climate change impacts. They are asking for more activities at the field level. That might be one of the reasons that the Constitution of Nepal has clearly indicated, for climate change adaptation, carbon service, carbon sequestration, adaptation plans, or capacity building, climate change modeling. These things in the constitutional provision that I think would contribute to at the local level to identify, to first identify how they are vulnerable, because we have the national framework for vulnerability and risk assessment based on fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the local government is empowered to collect local taxes and formulate and implement local level development plans and projects. They are also empowered to have local level low carbon, environment friendly development and community level adaptation actions. That I think the entry point to prioritize their development activities in this process.
Right. I think you've painted a very clear and quite a positive picture of vertical integration for the NAP process, and actually for adaptation policy in general in Nepal. But Bhattaji, Nepal, of course, is a developing country, so I'm sure there are challenges that you faced along the way in ensuring that subnational governments have a say or are engaged in this process. So looking across the three areas that Angie talked about before this, institutional arrangements, information sharing, capacity development, which of these are, according to you, some of the key challenges that remain to ensure greater engagement of subnational actors in the national adaptation planning process?
First, what I think is on the constitutional provision, clear cut, how the structure of the local government will be. It is still on the working process. But what I consider is there must be a planning division, and our approach is to integrate adaptation into the plans. And once it is integrated, and there will also an outreach program to mostly the information, education, and communication or knowledge generation, and sharing, training section or like that, including monitoring and evaluation. This is a normal practice of those structures in the local government, or based on our experience in some of the districts, in 14 districts out of 75 districts, almost 1/5 of the total area. The local governments are also interested to have a separate climate change or climate change adaptation section, but to have an inbuilt mechanism, some sort of institutional mechanism to address these climate change impacts. Basically, it will basically depend upon the weightage of the local government's act on climate change in general. That is what we are thinking, and that is why our emphasis is on how we can provide some provisions to address climate change adaptation through legal mechanism. That is thinking on that. The bottlenecks are capacity building. That is it is some level of awareness, but we need to enhance their capacity to implement adaptation action. One, and the other one is always the finance, because we are the LDCs.
Right. Thank you, Batuji. I think
Third one
that was
might be
really
some sort of
informative.
technology.
I think that was really informative. I think the key takeaway from me from what you've just said is that I think an official mandate is vitally important, but there is a vital role for non-government actors to work in close collaboration with the government to make sure that this mandate is actually brought to life and executed. Certainly, our experience in India has been that even though there is a strong mandate for vertical integration of adaptation policy, it's key, it's very important to work at the subnational level with the actors who are supposed to be engaged in the process and facilitate a closer integration of their closer integration with the official policy process that is supposed to unfold through coordinating meetings, providing information, and shepherding the process along with the government. I'd like to thank you very much for giving us your time and these rich insights on vertical integration. And I'm going to hand it back to
Can
Hayley.
I just take
Oh,
1
sorry,
minute?
go on. Sure.
Can I just take 1 minute? Because
Please.
we have 200 members right now in 9 working groups, and they represent service provider, beneficiaries, enablers, advocates, policy advisors, policy stakeholders, and these are, I think, the building block for integration at the level. That is, these one members will be actively engaged in the whole process of NAP. They will impart information at the local level. They will also collect inputs from the local level to build in for the NAP process. That is what we consider is very important.
Great. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Batuji, for your contribution. Hayley, over to you for any questions.
Thank you so much, both Aditya and Batu. That was really informative and great to hear about the experience in the region. So we actually have some questions coming in already. I have 2, but welcome everyone else as well to enter any questions you have. We have just under 15 minutes to go through some of these. So I have one so far for Angie. I'll do that first, then one to Aditya. And just to go back to the results of the poll, I don't think we shared those, but developing capacity at subnational levels was the response that got the majority of votes in terms of the biggest challenge that countries are facing. So if you have questions about that for our presenters, please do enter them. But first of all, for Angie, a question from Joy Muller is actually on the knowledge sharing and information sharing dimension. So could you advise on mechanisms for knowledge sharing or knowledge management that would facilitate policy implementation at national and local levels?
Thanks. I think this is a really interesting question. I think rather than advising, because I believe it's definitely a context-specific issue, I'll maybe share one experience, which is actually one of the case examples that we've included in the guidance note. And it's the case of Colombia, where they've established climate change regional nodes. And these are multi-stakeholder platforms made up of government, private sector, research institutions, universities, and civil society organizations. And I think the interesting thing about these platforms is that they group together departments, which are the level below the national level, with municipalities, which are the local level governance structure in Colombia. And the key thing is that the groupings aren't based on an administrative structure. They're based, the departments and municipalities are grouped together based on the fact that they share particular characteristics. And I think that really maximizes the potential for the different members of the platform to share knowledge and experiences because they're dealing with similar issues, working in similar contexts. And I think the other really interesting thing about this is that the model actually emerged organically when 3 departments that include coffee growing areas got together and really wanted to share experiences on climate change, what they were experiencing in terms of impacts and how they were responding. And what has happened now is that the government has recognized the value of this kind of platform for sharing information and knowledge. And so nodes are being established in other parts of the country where different issues are coming up, different contexts, and it's being formalized into the institutional arrangements for climate change adaptation planning in Colombia. So I think that's a really interesting example. It came out of a desire to share information, and now it has become part of the formal institutional arrangements.
Great, thank you, Angie. So there was another question that came in. This one was specifically for Aditya from Van Tran Pham. And the question was how to formulate and manage multi-sector and multi-district projects. So projects that need to be both horizontally and vertically integrated. And he says vertical integration is important, but he finds in his context sometimes it's the horizontal integration that can be more difficult. So Aditya, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Sure, I couldn't agree more, because I think horizontal integration can be far more challenging because everyone likes to protect their turf. Everyone is busy getting on with what their individual sector they're supposed to deliver in their sectoral silos. So you really have to show them what is in it for them to come together cross-sectorally. I think in India, a good example of horizontal integration at the subnational level are state climate change cells. These exist, of course, on paper and across all the states, and in some states they function really well. In some states they don't function really well. And essentially these are housed within the Department of Environment at the state level in India, and are supposed to have representatives from all government departments. One representative is supposed to be there in the state climate change cells as a sort of multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral coordination committee. In certain examples where these state cells work really well is when people understand about how climate change is affecting each of their individual sectors. So how is it affecting agriculture, how is it affecting water or public works or urban development. So there's a clear understanding on what the impacts of climate change are, how it's relevant to their sector. And then it's also then why it's worked well is because people are starting to understand that they cannot only respond to climate change from the narrow confines of their sectoral silos. It's only if an urban development person links in with a person working on water that together they can start to tackle climate-induced water scarcity, in cities or in rural areas. So it's this sort of understanding of how climate change is going to impact the sectors, and then an understanding about how a sectoral response is inadequate. I think that's what seems to be working, and many times in India, it's been a case of an external agent coming and catalyzing the process of conversations across sectoral silos to make sure that this horizontal integration actually happens. So I don't know if that's an adequate answer, and I mean I agree with you that it's difficult to manage projects where there's an imperative for horizontal as well as vertical. But I think thankfully, again, if I take the example of India, where there's sort of a fairly clear governance structure and quite a clear and strong presence of government even at the local levels, there are institutional mechanisms that mandate that. There are already existing ways in which national governments deal with state governments on a variety of issues, and there are existing ways in which state governments deal with district level governments, and existing ways in which district level governments deal with urban local bodies or village governments. So there are these different governance structures, and many times it's a case of sort of catalyzing closer integration, either through visionaries within government, which certainly exist, or through non-government actors who work in close collaboration with government bodies.
Great, thank you, Aditya. So I have another one. This one's for either Batu or Aditya.
Can I add on it?
Yeah, of course.
Can
go
I
ahead.
add on it?
Yeah, go ahead.
From Nepal experience, I find it, horizontal integration a little bit much more easier, and then go to the vertical. approach is when we prepared climate change policy in 2011, then other sector policies also started including climate change adaptation and the mitigation aspects. And those policies, for example, forest policy, water resources policy, irrigation policy, once the climate change is integrated into other sectoral policies, then the local institutions, for example, district forest office, also started implementing climate change activities based on forest policy. Not only so that this because of small country as well. For the larger country, big countries, it might not work. But in our case, if we have an umbrella, policy or any instrument, then it will be first horizontally integrated, and then horizontal integration will support for to reach it to the local level through vertical integration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Batu. So I have at least one more question. If you have other questions, do feel free to send them in. We'll have a record of them that we can also share with presenters. But I'll take one more for now. This one was for Batu or Aditya. So it's from, and I'm going to apologize for mispronouncing the name, Nakanyeli Bolo Speaks. Saying that in the Pacific, at the local level, the private sector is a key player, and they have a lot of technical and financial capacity to link adaptation into development programming. But a lot currently is sustained by donor funding. So he's asking about the experience at the local level with the private sector in India and Nepal, how they're engaged and what incentives are there. So Aditya or Batu, did either of you want to start on that one?
Sure, I have some insights on that, but I'll let Batuji go first if he has any thoughts on engagement of the private sector.
Okay, thank you. During the operation process, we forgot to include, private sector. It might be because that it takes some time to benefit the private sector. But this time, the tourism, and natural resources working group to look after and in that working group, more than 50% are from the private sector. So the private sector are now engaged in the NAP formulation process, particularly in one. In other sectors, the private sector are engaged, but they are represented. But some sector, they are much more interested, and they are asking for more vulnerability assessment. For example, for the key tourist destination, and in the but from the planning perspective, from the adaptation planning perspective, we have really very encouraging, in the private sector.
Great, thank you, Batu. Aditya, did you want to add anything?
Yes, please. A quick response. I think we've done some sort of close thinking on how to engage with the private sector on adaptation meaningfully, because now it is impossible to go to a workshop or a conference on resilience and adaptation and not have someone bring up the private sector. Yet, I sometimes feel that the discussions at the moment on private sector engagement are not as robust as they could be. There's a general understanding that we need to engage with them, but not a clear understanding of how. And according to our program, there are 3 clear imperatives for the private sector to engage in adaptation. There's either business continuity. So we explain to businesses that unless you undertake adaptation, climate proof your value chains, etc., you will not continue to deliver the services and goods that you want to, and therefore your profits will suffer. So the first imperative is business continuity. The other is business opportunity. So there's money to be made in adaptation. Bridges need to be climate proof. New kinds of capacities need to be built. New processes need to be put in place. And therefore, private sector can be engaged from an opportunity perspective. And the third is business as stakeholder. This is a little more of a fuzzy idea, but in countries like India, where there is a strong legislative thrust on ensuring that large corporations devote part of their profits to corporate social responsibility, there is a growing understanding of how these funds that they're officially mandated to spend on social sector programs can go towards adaptation. our own program in Maharashtra, which is one of the 9 locations that we work, we're working with 5 private sector corporations and designing adaptation interventions for them at the local level in line with government policies. So we've taken existing government policies that are around adaptation or watershed management. We made sure that the corporate social responsibility funds that these large corporations have to spend are going in activities that are helping the government achieve the objectives for these schemes. So some growing understanding of what are the incentives and imperatives for the engagement of the private sector, but the need for a much richer body of evidence. And if there is such a body of evidence in the Pacific Islands, I can tell you there are lots of people who would be interested to see how you're actually engaging with them at that level.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for your presentations and for your responses to the questions, and to everyone on the line for participation and for your engagement. I'm sorry we don't have time to get through all of the questions, but like I said, we'll have a record and we can share them with the presenters. So maybe just before we wrap up, in terms of next steps, as a reminder, Angie mentioned and we mentioned earlier, you have all the resources from the NAP Global Network related to vertical integration in the handout and in some of your reminder emails related to the webinar. So the guidance note, it's available in English, Spanish, and French. We have a series of snapshots with some country case studies as well, specifically on, so far we have one on developing capacity for subnational adaptation in Sudan and information and sharing in South Africa. And the presentations will be online with links to the resources Aditya referred to as well. Upcoming webinars, we'll be doing one on monitoring and evaluation in the NAP process in a month or so's time, so stay tuned for that. And then a subset of webinars on financing the NAP process, so looking at things like domestic public finance, international public finance, and private sector finance. And just a reminder that if you are interested in further participation in the network, there's a number of ways you can get involved. The first step is just to join online as a network participant, and that way you'll receive our updates on this and many other activities. And just as a final note, you will get a survey that should launch when you leave the webinar, just to give us a sense of what you liked, what we could do better, as well as in your follow-up email. So we'd greatly appreciate any feedback. So yeah, again, thanks to all our presenters and to the participants, and we hope we'll have you on a future webinar soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.